I spoke in the last lecture about the concept as I see it on history, which we find in the Hebrew Bible and in the later Jewish tradition. And the main point I was trying to emphasize was that in this tradition, man makes his own history. You might say under the guidance of God, but not in the way that God makes history for him by an act of grace. I try to show that all that God does is, in the Hebrew Bible, is to send his prophets which give a message, which show alternatives, and which protest. And the protesting is very important for the prophetic mission. And that's why the prophets were such subversive people. They have always protested, and they have protested in no uncertain terms. But then they left it to man, and therefore in this concept of history, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish tradition, you find a concept which I shall talk about later, namely of the freedom of man, even of the freedom of man to do evil, of the freedom of man to make mistakes, and yet this freedom is not limited even by an act of grace. And this independence is not limited even by an act of grace. Now, if we want to turn to the complete picture of history in the Old Testament and in the Jewish tradition, then we cannot do so without then turning to one of the central issues in the Old Testament, and that is the concept of the Messianic time. Perhaps the best introduction to the concept of the Messianic time is to return to the beginning of history. The beginning of history is when man and woman leaves the Garden of Eden because they have disobeyed and because they feel estranged from each other, and yet for the first time this disobedience is an act of freedom. And then comes this peculiar, you can say it's usually called curse, it's also curse in the text, which God pronounces upon man and nature. And I read you the corresponding lines here. It's the 3rd chapter of Genesis, verse 14 to 19. And God said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. I just wanted to call your attention to the fact that, of course, if the serpent is cursed to crawl on the belly, before the curse, the serpent did not crawl on the belly and was not a serpent as we see a serpent. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Here you have the curse or the prediction, or whatever you call it, of enmity between man and nature, between man and animal. Then it goes on, and unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. This is enmity between men and women. Here, however, I want to make the same remark as I made about the serpent. If it is the curse that man shall rule over the woman, obviously until that time he did not rule over the woman. And it is quite clear, it seems to me, historically speaking, that you find remnants here of a matriarchal period in which it was not the man who ruled the woman, maybe the woman who ruled men, or where the sexes were equal. The curse, as a curse here, male dominance is established in the enmity between the sexes. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake, in sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and also thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. Now here, you might say, is the curse of labor, the curse of work, that man and nature are in conflict, man and animal, man and woman, and man and the soil. And with this conflict, human history begins. And what is the aim of history? What is the end of history in this viewpoint? It is the undoing of this curse. Where there was conflict and struggle, there shall be harmony and peace. And if you take the whole ideal of the Messianic time, then you cannot fully understand it without referring to this beginning of history in the first book of Moses. And you will find a whole philosophy of history which says human history has to begin with the estrangement of man from nature, between man and woman, and in the overcoming of this estrangement or alienation, if you like, in the overcoming of this, man develops, and he develops to the point where he establishes a new harmony between man and animal, between man and nature, and between man and women, and where man finds himself at home in the world again. Only this time not anymore at home in a pre-individualistic sense, but in a sense of a man who is fully developed and who is at home in the world. This is actually the idea of the Messianic time which the prophets developed. Now, of course, there is a great wealth of various ideas in the prophetic idea of the Messianic time. The prophets do not share all the same opinions. They do not have all the same visions. And one could talk for many hours alone about the Messianic vision of the prophetic time, for which there is no time here. So I shall try to show you some quotations only from one prophet, and really, historically speaking, that's not one prophet either, namely Isaiah. His vision of peace or harmony among men, between man and nature, and his concept of universalism. If I use the word peace here, I want to add that in Hebrew the word peace is not, as it often is meant in our modern language, the absence of war. But peace, shalom, has the meaning of completion, harmony. And it is not just a negative statement or negative concept of absence of strife, but it is a concept of harmony, of a restored harmony, which was torn in the process of man's becoming man. Now let me read you a few statements. First of all, the concept of this kind of harmony between man and man from Isaiah. That is Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, where he says, "And it shall come to pass." Now let me read just this one verse. "And he shall judge," namely God, "among the nations, and shall rebuke many peoples." And then comes this famous passage, which I assume most of you know. "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." This concept that man will not learn war anymore is very important. You find a similar statement, I quoted one before, where this time of human peace is characterized by the statement, men will not be afraid of each other anymore. There will be no more fear, and there will be no more learning of war. Certainly the prophetic concept of peace was not that armed strength and destructive weapons make for peace or guarantee peace. You find this statement here in Isaiah repeated in other prophets in the one or the other form. But this is the classic formulation here of unity between men. Now, let me read you another statement of Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6 to 9, where he says, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion, the fatling together, and the little child shall lead them. And the cow and the bear shall feed. Their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. And the suckling child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." Now here you see in a very clear form the change of the curse of conflict between man and animal. Animals among themselves and man and animal, even a little child, are in a state of harmony. It's very important to understand that in the biblical concept of harmony, of peace, of the Messianic time, this is not only a state of harmony between man and man, but it is also a state of harmony between man and nature. Nature ceases to be hostile to man. If I would use a word by Marx, who is in fact, although not in his consciousness, deeply rooted in this biblical tradition, in this Messianic tradition, I would say, and that would also be a quotation from Zen Buddhism, just the same, and that is, nature becomes human and man becomes natural. The conflict between man and nature, in which the two try to dominate or to destroy each other, this conflict yields to a new harmony between man and nature. This is a very basic idea for the humanism of the Old Testament, as it is basic for the humanism of Zen Buddhism, and it is indeed referring to that split between man and nature which has occurred in the story of the expulsion from the paradise. Let me read another statement from Isaiah, that's chapter 35, where he mentions another element which is very important for the prophetic concept of the Messianic time. "The wilderness and solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as a rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given unto it. The excellency of Carmel and Sharon shall see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of our God. Say to them that are of a fearful heart, Be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with a vengeance, even God with a recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame leap as an hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert. And the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water. And the habitation of dragons where each lay shall be grass with reeds and rushes. And a highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for those. The wayfaring men, though fools, shall not err therein. No lion shall be there, nor any ravenous beast shall go up thereon. It shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Now here you have a slightly different concept. This is the highway in which even a fool cannot lose his way. It's a highway in which there are no lions, rather than in the previous picture that the lion and man will be in peace. But you see here the concept of joy as a very essential part in the picture of the Messianic time and of abundance. this picture which you see so often in the prophetic writing, that the desert will be full of water, that water will spring from the desert. This miracle of the transformation of sterility into fertility, that also is one of the essential elements in the Messianic concept of man's new harmony with nature. Now let me read you again from the later chapters of Isaiah here. One verse, no, it's actually more than one. Let me see here. It's chapter 65, which says, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered nor come into mind. But be you glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem a rejoicing and her people a joy. And I will rejoice in Jerusalem and joy in my people. And the voice of weeping will be no more heard in her, nor the voice of crying. There shall be no more thence an infant of days, nor an old man that has not filled his days. For the child shall die at 100 years old, but the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For as the days of a tree are the days of my people, and mine elect shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain, nor bring forth for trouble, for they are the seed of the blessed of the Lord, and their offspring with them. And it shall come to pass that before they call, I will answer. And while they are yet speaking, I will hear." Now you see here perhaps an interesting connection with what I have been saying last time about the sigh of the Hebrews raising to God, although they do not call to God. Here you have the formulation, "Before they call, I shall answer." And I reminded you last time of another prophetic formulation, "I shall be found by those who do not seek me." It is often been said that the God of the Old Testament, is a God of severity, of revenge, and all this. There are indeed passages which are in this vein, but certainly you find passages in which the God of a loving God is described in the most tender and poetic fashion. Like here, this saying, I shall answer before they call. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like the bullock, and dust shall be the serpent's meat. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountains, says the Lord. And perhaps one last quote from Isaiah, that is chapter 19, verse 24 and 25, which is an expression of the universalism and humanism of this idea of human harmony and human unity, where the prophet says, "In that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." Here, the enemies of Israel are the ones who are blessed by God, and they are called my people and my inheritance, like Israel is my inheritance. Here in the prophet you see already how the idea of Israel as the favorite child of God, and thereby superior to other nations, has been replaced in this particular part, and there are other parts similar, by a new idea of universalism. And that is that all nations are just as much the favorites and just as much the children of God. And I want to remind you of this Talmudic story which I told you last time, that when the Egyptians drowned in the sea, that God was forbidding the angels to sing the hymns of jubilation, because saying, "How can you be singing hymns when my children have drowned. That Talmudic story is exactly, in a different style, in a different version, what you find here in this statement expressed by the prophet Isaiah. There's perhaps nothing more characteristic. I say nothing more characteristic because it's not the only characteristic thing for the Jewish tradition than this messianic hope. And the hope that in history man will be liberated by his own effort, but that history has a goal. History is not a return of the same. History is not a circle. History is not even cyclic. But history has a goal, and only one possible goal, and that is to find an answer to the question of man's estrangement from himself and from the rest of the world. And indeed, it is a most remarkable phenomenon that this belief in the goal of history, that is to say, in the coming of the Messiah, has really been most deeply imbued in the Jews as long as they were filled with their own religious tradition. Now it's very interesting to see the Jewish concept of how the times of the Messiah will be brought about. I think basically one can differentiate between two versions. One is implicit or explicit in some of the prophets, that is, that of a development of mankind, which will eventually lead to a state of enlightenment in which the knowledge of God will fill man, as the prophet says, as the waters cover the earth, as the ocean covers the earth. And at the end of this development, quite naturally, the Messianic time will be ushered. Incidentally, it is perhaps necessary to say, in this tradition, the Messiah is never the Redeemer. He is a symbol of the new time. He means literally the anointed one, the one who comes from the descendant of David. He appears when man is ready. He is not the one who saves man by his appearance. You find this one version, as I said, and then you find exactly the contrary one already in the prophets, and you find it later especially in the apocalyptic literature, and that is quite the contrary. The Messiah will come when man has reached the depth of depravity, when man is completely humanized, when man has gone, so to speak, to the bottom of negation. At this point, the miracle will happen and men will be open to the Messiah. You find that already indicated in, let us say, in a verse of the prophet Joel, which I shall quote, where he says, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." Now, you find that in the apocalyptic literature, you find in the Talmudic literature, there are descriptions which are most colorful to show what degree of deprivation and of depravity men must reach in order to return. Actually, you find, strangely enough, the very same idea, that's only a footnote, in the philosophy of history of Karl Marx. His assumption was precisely the same as a messianic assumption, that the very class, as he thought, the working class, who was the most dehumanized one, the most alienated one, would become, so to speak, the active agent for bringing about what is equivalent of the messianic time for Marx. That is to say that it is very much the same idea that when man had reached the complete poverty in a spiritual sense, then man would be ready and perhaps forced to make the big leap into knowledge. It is very similar also to what I was talking about last time in reading you the Psalm 20, the 22nd Psalm. Now, you actually have in the Jewish tradition this mixture of ideas, whether the arrival of the Messiah is brought about by the big tragedy in human history, or whether it is brought about in more peaceful and in a more direct line. You have another problem, which is very interesting, I think very interesting for us today also, in the Jewish tradition about the belief in the arrival of the Messiah. You have in actually two principles. One is, to put it very briefly, the Messiah can come every day. You must be expecting the Messiah every day. Right now, at this moment, the Messiah could come. That is to say, this is not a hope. This is not the hope sometime the Messiah will come, but this is the immediacy of the expectation of the arrival of the Messiah, which could happen in the here and now, which could happen every moment right here. And then you have another principle, and that is, don't force the Messiah. You cannot force his arrival, because if you force him, you are acting outside of reality. Nothing can be created by force, nor the Messiah, and included in that is a Messiah. Let me give you an example for the sense of immediacy of expecting the Messiah, and at the same time for this paradox that you cannot force him, by a Talmudic story where a rabbi asked, where can I meet the Messiah? And he got the answer, well, you can meet him very easily. He is one of the beggars who sit at the gates of Rome. And the rabbi asked, but how can there are hundreds of beggars? How can I know who is the Messiah? And the answer was, that's very easy. All beggars have sore legs, and so they nurse their wounds, and they do it in the way that they first take care of their left leg, they unbandage it, put oil on it, bandage it again, and then of their right leg. You will only find one beggar. No, pardon me. I told it the wrong way. You will find all beggars first unbandaging both legs, and then putting oil on them, and then bandaging it. You will only find one beggar who will do first completely his left leg, and after he's through with that, his right leg. And the rabbi asked why, and the answer was because he cannot afford, even for one moment, to be incapacitated when he is called, and therefore he cannot afford to being in a position of not using his legs for more than a minute, because the call could reach him every moment. And that is why, and that's how you will recognize the Messiah. So the rabbi went to the gates of Rome. He saw the one beggar who nursed his wounds in this particular way, and he asked him, are you the Messiah? And the beggar said, yes. And then he asked him, when will you come? And the Messiah said, tomorrow. The rabbi was very happy. And so he went home, expecting the next day the Messiah would come, but he did not come. And when he met, I forgot at the moment, I think it was one of the prophets, who was on earth then, he told him the Messiah is a liar. And the prophet said, why is he a liar? He told me, said the rabbi, he will come tomorrow, and he didn't come. And the prophet said, no, the Messiah is not a liar. When he said, I'll come tomorrow, he meant if you are ready. But you were not ready. And therefore, while the Messiah is prepared to come tomorrow, while the Messiah is prepared to come every moment, to come now, nevertheless, he can only come when man is prepared to receive him, when man has changed. The waiting for the Messiah the not pushing appears in a very interesting story, which is a disputation in the Middle Ages of which we have a record, where, as it often happens, a pope invited a number of rabbis to Rome to have a discussion with a priest who at that time usually was a former rabbi who had been converted to the Catholic religion. And the Pope often enjoyed the spectacle of these clever men talking. And usually these discussions were quite free, although you never could be quite sure. So the report tells us the rabbis came to Rome the evening before. They talked together and discussed what they should do. They had been asked where everyone lived, his address, and they got a little worried about that, and they were told that was routine. It was really didn't mean anything bad. And so they said, we must only avoid one thing, and that is, to use a Jewish term, chutzpah. That is to say, when we speak with a pope, we must not say anything which could irritate him, because otherwise the situation might be a little bit too delicate. Well, the disputation was around the point that the opponent had quoted a Talmudic statement which he interpreted as meaning that the Messiah was born at the same time when Jesus was born. That was his interpretation of the Talmudic statement. And he said, if that is so, then the Talmud says that Jesus is a Messiah, therefore you have to recognize that Jesus is a Messiah. Well, at first the rabbis said that isn't so, the whole interpretation isn't true. But their opponent insisted that his interpretation was true. And so one rabbi said, well, even if it is true, it doesn't mean at all that this was a Messiah. And the Pope said, how can you say such a thing? And the rabbi said, well, if that is so, then he may have been born 1,500 years ago, but he is still waiting to come because man is not ready. Whereupon the Pope said, well, got kind of angry and said, how can you want me to believe such nonsense, that the Messiah is already waiting 1,500 years in the wings of history, so to speak, and is still waiting. And then one of the rabbis said to the Pope, which was indeed what he was not supposed to do, because that was chutzpah, he said, if you want to believe us so much nonsense in your religion, why can't we have some nonsense in ours also? Well, the Pope got very angry, and the rabbis got quite frightened, but everything ended, luckily, without anything worse happening. But in this story, you see the concept, which was not at all nonsensical for the rabbis, that the Messiah would wait for 1,500 years. So he could come any moment, and yet you could not force him. Now, actually, in Jewish history, you know, there have been a number of false messiahs. The two most famous ones are Bar Kokhba, the son of the stars, who was later on the son of lies, and later on Sabbatai Tzvi. Well, there were more, but these are the two most famous ones. Bar Kokhba in 135 claimed that he was a Messiah and that a rebellion against Rome led by him would liberate Jerusalem and would recreate the temple. There was a strong peace party against him, but strangely enough, Rabbi Akiva, who had been one of the greatest leaders of the peace-loving and non-nationalistic wing of the Pharisees, eventually sided with Bar Kokhba and really believed what Bar Kokhba's claim. Another rabbi said to him, grass will long have grown over your grave before the Messiah comes. Another rabbi opened his window when he heard the news and said, I see no change. The Messiah has not come. He's not the Messiah. Well, this was one false Messiah, which ended with the slaughters of many thousands of Jews and some Romans probably, and which ended with a deep disappointment, where Messianic hope had turned out to be a lie. Now in 1666, that's about 1500 years later, another man from Turkey, Sabbatai Tzvi, claimed to be the Messiah. And again, the Jews all over the world were willing to believe him. Jews in Europe, in Germany, they sold their houses. They began to wander towards Palestine because they believed the Messiah had come. Well, he was also a false Messiah. The Sultan, the Turkish Sultan, felt kind of annoyed or slightly threatened by this movement. So he confronted the Messiah, the pseudo-Messiah, with the alternative of either being imprisoned or killed or becoming a Muslim. He preferred to become a Muslim, which in the eyes of the Jews was really, and always has been, one of the arch sins to be converted to another religion. Because the Jews have always suspected converts to have done it as a matter of opportunism and not as a matter of faith. And indeed, the conversion of this false Messiah was perhaps one of the most serious traumas the Jewish people have suffered in their history, because their hope for the Messianic time had been kindled, had been excited in the most concrete and dramatic way, and it all turned out to be a lie. It is very interesting how some of the followers of Sabbatai Tzvi have reacted. Some of his followers used reasoning which corresponds to some mystical ideas which you find in Jewish mysticism and other mysticism, and that is that the one who wants to save others must himself have delved into the depth of sin, because if he has not gone through the sin himself, how can he save others? Well, that is not such a irrational idea. In fact, there's much to be said for this idea. But it was used here to rationalize the refusal to admit that Sabbatai Tzvi was an impostor. Because the idea was, the very fact that he has committed the worst sin, namely to become a Muslim, that proves precisely why he is a Messiah. And therefore, that which would disprove that he was a Messiah proves that he was a Messiah. Now, you will find this kind of logic of reasoning among all fanatics until this day, because if you are bent to believe in something and cannot afford to debunk it or to disbelieve it, then you will go to any lengths to find an argument why your belief is right. It doesn't matter what the belief is, people do that all the time. I would say one could perhaps describe the traditional Jewish position towards the Messiah as a position of the paradox of hope, in which both sides of the polarity, both sides of the conflict are true. Namely, one, you must expect the Messiah every day, and at the same time you cannot force him. If you separate this polarity, if you only live on the one side of this polarity, you either become a man who, like many of us, say, yes, sometime things will be all right, but they have lost the immediate expectation. This becomes nothing but a vague hope. In Spanish, you have the word esperar, which means at the same time to hope and to wait. In Hebrew, tikva, hope, comes from a root of the tension of the bow and the arrow. This is a dynamic hope. The other one is a waiting hope. Now, if hope has only the point one cannot force it, then it is the kind of hope which many good people have today, that everything will be all right one day. But in the meantime, there's nothing we can do about it. But if you try to force the Messiah, then you disobey, you might say, the laws of reality. Because, as I said before, the Messiah cannot be forced. Then you are irresponsible. then you are a fanatic. And in other words, what I'm trying to say is the avoidance both of the passive expectation of the fanatical force is possible only if the dichotomy or if the conflict between immediate expectation and not forcing remains together. If one lives every moment on both sides of this polarity. Now that is logically absurd, but it's not at all absurd as an experience. And this holds true not only with regard to the Messiah, it holds true for all our life and for all our hopes. Many people live without hope because once their hope has been shattered, and so their hope becomes weak. They feel sometimes, somehow, somewhere, maybe something will happen. Some people are fanatics, and that is self-defeating too. I think one can describe the traditional Jewish position in this problem as that, as I said, of the paradox of hope, in which both sides of the polarity remain alive together and do not become separated. You have, of course, another situation of hope which occurred at the same time, rather over 100 years earlier, and that is in the situation of Christianity. When the Christian message came alive, then indeed it was a hope. That's a fact to which Albert Schweitzer and a number of other theologians have pointed. The essence of the message was the kingdom of heaven is near. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but it is near. It is not something which will happen sometimes. And this was indeed the essence of the Christian message. It was, in fact, in another version, a Messianic message of the immediacy of the Messiah. And then something happened to this message. Christ did not return. The decisive event had not happened. And then something else happened, namely, the hope for the return for the second coming of Christ was not given up, but it became a hope of the future. And in the meantime, the church took the place, became the substitute for the change which the advent of the Messiah was to bring. Now, it is a peculiar thing that this whole Hebrew Christian concept, but more actually Jewish than Christian, namely of the hope for completion of history, for an aim in history which was the new world, the new mankind, the new heart, the new heaven and earth. All this has become, strangely enough, quite acute in European thought after the Renaissance, in the 18th and 19th century, where religious thinking was largely transformed from theological terms in historical terms. You find in Europe from the Renaissance on, but you find it especially with the French Revolution in the 18th century and the 19th century, a tremendous wave of hope. And a wave of hope which really was corresponding or the equivalent of the kingdom of heaven. That was a kind of hope which a man like Marx was moved by. It was not the hope of more goulash, as Mr. Khrushchev said recently, but it was a hope for a new man. This hope was in him, as turned out to be, as wrong, and Engels said so after Marx's death, as a hope of Rabbi Akiva, or as a hope of the adherents of Sabbatai Tzvi. But undoubtedly, Western Europe in the 18th and 19th century continued that hope which was such a typical element in Messianic thinking, namely of the redemption within history, of the redemption of man within history. And then happened this most peculiar event in Western history, that this hope seems to have been killed at one day, and that was the 2nd of August 1914. After 100 years of peace, after a development which seemed to lead man close to the fulfillment of his hope, suddenly everything broke down. And this war was conducted with the utter disregard for human lives. It is not sufficiently known, although there's an increasing literature now. I remind you of the book of Miss Tuchman, which some of you have read, The Guns of August. There are some other books published in English. There was, just to mention one thing to give you an idea, that many generals on both sides wanted to have high losses in men because they saw that they couldn't gain much territory for 4 years almost. There were frontal attacks. The Battle of Verdun was only one of the outstanding events in this, and every fool could have seen that that was not the way to end the war. But the generals wanted fame. And so if they could report that an attack, while it had gained only a few miles of territory, that in that attack 30,000, 40,000 soldiers had died, then he could prove his soldiers were courageous. And that was a good thing for him, because then he had trained his soldiers to be so courageous, to die for nothing. And that was the method in which this war was conducted. It was one of the most inhuman tactics and strategies which were ever employed in a war. And that was only the beginning. Then came the increasing terror of Stalin. Then came Hitler. Then came Coventry. Then came Dresden. It may not be known to all of you that the air attack on Dresden cost more lives than Hiroshima. 150,000 people, most of them women and children, were killed in one night, burned to death by the attack on Dresden. And then came the atomic attack, and then comes that mankind lives for years preparing for a Holocaust which would destroy the very best, all we call civilization, maybe all of the human race. This all has happened within 50 years, after a period in which the Western world had, in a peculiar way since the Renaissance, adopted that particular part of the Jewish tradition which was a Messianic hope. For those of you who have the bad luck of being disconnected with the tradition of the 19th century and the good luck of not being so old, it is probably very hard to imagine the real, genuine, authentic hope which pervaded the 19th century until 1914. And for that reason, you perhaps are not aware, but sufficiently, the kind of hopelessness which pervades the world increasingly now. I wanted to talk about the concept of God. I'm sorry and have to apologize that these lectures do not follow precisely what was announced. It is very difficult, unless one has a prepared text, which I do not have, to speak spontaneously and to keep in 5 lectures exactly the timetable which was announced before. I know this is an inconvenience for some of you who come here expecting a certain topic to be dealt with in one lecture and is somewhat overlapping. I can only apologize for it. I shall now come, and we'll have to finish next time, the topic which was announced for this lecture, namely the concept of God. Let me first say, perhaps begin with a statement. Who is God? I would say God is he or that to whom man is to develop and to become alike. The concept of God has something to do with the activity of man. God is a goal in the traditional monotheistic religions towards whom man's development is to follow, so that man becomes more and more alike to God. That is, I think, a safe statement to make about God from the standpoint of Jewish theology. But indeed, I spoke about this before, God is really a word for an X, for a new goal, which is that of a new unity of man with nature, instead of the attempt to find unity by regressing to nature and to eliminate that which is specifically human, that is his awareness, his reason. This new goal, for reasons which are very hard to know, filled the minds of man all over the world between 1500 BC to 500 BC. Lao Tse called it Tao, the way, the Buddhist nirvana. Eknaton in Egypt, the symbol was the sun. The Hebrews called it God. And it is quite clear from my own standpoint that the name is due to historical accident. Not only the name in the sense of the word, but also the concept. Why the Buddhists, the Indians, and the Chinese developed a religion not too different from what the Jews and the Christians developed, essentially without a concept of God, is certainly a very difficult question which to answer I feel no competence. But I think it is a fact that the new goal, the new possibility for man, that towards which man is striving and to which man is wanting to be more and more alike, that this new goal was the same in various religions and yet had a different name. One can perhaps say one thing, and that is that first of all, the concept of God in the Hebrew tradition is a negative concept. Namely, it is easy to say that the concept of God implies what God is not, or what should not be God. Namely, man should not be God, the state should not be God, and an idol should not be God. If you want to understand the Hebrew concept of God, one can only understand it, how it grew out of the fight against idolatry. That fight was sometimes crude and sometimes subtle. And what is an idol? Let me try to describe briefly what I mean by an idol. First of all, you might say the idol is the object of man's central desire. For one man, money is an idol. For another man, power is an idol. For another man, food is an idol. But it's always the central object for his desire, and desire used here in the word of greed, for that what he wants. That's one aspect of the idol. Another aspect of the idol is that it's always a partial representation of something in man. An idol can represent strength, fertility, wisdom, but it's always a representation of a partial quality which is in man. A third approach to the definition of an idol would be to say an idol always represents man's own powers in an alienated way. By alienated, I mean man transfers, man projects something which is in him, let us say his thought, his reason, his strength, his courage, his love, unto an object, and he's in touch with himself only inasmuch as he submits to that idol. That is to say, he does not feel himself anymore as the active, productive agent, subject of an activity, but only by submission to the idol to which he has transferred all his riches and all his wealth in a human sense. Only by that is he in touch with himself. And that leads to another function of the idol, and that is worship of the idol is always submission, excludes freedom and independence. Precisely because you have projected to the idol all that you want, you can receive it back, as it were, only by submitting to the idol. The idol wants slaves and not free men. That's why, I mentioned this last time, Moses has to say to Pharaoh, God wants us to give him a feast in the wilderness. That's what an idol wants. But he does not want free men. And in the very nature of idolatry lies unfreedom. Now, of course, if we speak of idolatry today, we think perhaps of the idols of Baal and Astarte, and we think perhaps of some wooden figures which Africans sometimes still use, or we think of something which is far away from us. The very truth is, of course, that most of us are worshippers of idols. Our idols today are the state. Our idols are the economy. Our idols are the gadgets. Our idols are things to which we submit. And that's why most of us are unfree and dependent in spite of all the talk about freedom. Or rather, we talk so much about freedom because we have to cover up the fact that we are so little free. Now, the concept of God at first was, you might say, a concept what God is not. God is not an idol. Because God is not a thing. God is not a partial quality which has been deified and to which man submits. Indeed, man is in the relationship to God free. Now, I seem to speak like a theologian, and I shall explain later that I'm not a theologian, and that when I use the word God here, well, from a strictly monotheistic standpoint, I shouldn't use it at all, because one should not talk about God and not about qualities. I shall speak about that next time. I use the word God here, you might say poetically, symbolically, because it's a word which the Old Testament uses. And mind you, this is precisely what Maimonides said in his main philosophical work, that the way in which the Bible speaks is a way in which one often has to speak to children, to the ignorant ones. And therefore you find expressions which hide the truth, because you have to talk to people to whom you have to express the truth in a form which they can understand. So if we follow Maimonides here, we have to say, talking about God in the sense of monotheistic tradition is really talking symbolically, talking poetically, because otherwise it would be forbidden to talk about God. That would mean really taking God's name in vain. Let me perhaps say a few more words about one concept here which causes a lot of difficulties and confusion. And that is the concept that man must transcend himself. It is often said man must believe in God because if man is only centered around himself, who is he? He is nothing indeed if he is only centered around himself. But the word of transcending oneself, and this I say only for clarification's sake, without trying to make an argument for any particular religious position. The word of transcending can be used in two ways. One is, man transcends his ego. That is to say, that isolated delusion of an omnipotent, omniscient, powerful, eternally existing being, me. As long as I'm only for myself, I'm nothing. I am only myself if I am not for myself, if I'm open to the world, if I, to speak with the mystics and the Buddhists, if I am empty myself, or if I'm slaying myself, if I cross out and drop that ego, me, and all the illusions with it, and therefore become fully open to the world, then I transcend this isolated ego, and I transcend the illusion of this ego as the last piece of reality. But of course you can also, and that is the way it is often used, use the word transcendence, transcending man to God, to something outside of man. I'm only saying that the argument is often used as if the alternative were only to not transcending one's ego or to believe in God. This is not the only alternative. The person who believes in God, and let us say the religious person who is not a theist, who does not share the theistic belief in God, they would both agree that, first of all, even the belief in God has one condition, and that is to transcend the isolation of one's own ego, to empty oneself, and to be open to the world, and to develop those powers in oneself, which are those of which it is said they are gods, the powers of reason, the powers of love. Only the man who is confined to himself, who is full with himself, who believes in the eternity of his own ego, of this limited thing which is he, that man indeed is irreligious, both in the traditional sense of theistic religion and in the wider sense of a non-theistic, spiritual, mystical attitude, if you please. Now, it's time to stop now. I shall next time continue with this trend of thought and try to develop to try to show the development of the concept of God in the Jewish tradition, and to show, or at least to talk somewhat about the question, what is the problem of religion for man today? What does it really mean to believe in God or to be religious? What alternatives are there? This is a problem about which one could talk for many hours, but I shall at least spend a few minutes to talk about it, because I think many people are puzzled today. They have lost the connection with traditional religion, and they have not found ways and concepts to channel that spiritual need which you find in any more developed and civilized human being outside of the traditional concepts. And I shall also talk about the fact that the concept is really not so important, and that is also a part of the Jewish tradition, not to put so much importance of a thought concept, but rather on the reality of the way in which a man lives. Well, but that is for next time, and now we'll have about 10 minutes intermission, and as usual, the ushers will accept questions. Thank you. Two questions. One is the name of the book by Dr. Finkelstein, which I quoted last time. There are 2 volumes. The title is The Pharisees. The Pharisees, Pharisees. I cannot, I don't have it with me. I don't know the publisher, but certainly the best way of getting is to call up the bookstore, the Hebrew bookstore of Mr. Feldheim, Feldheim, 96 East Broadway, and I'm sure you can get it from there, or you can find the exact reference, the publisher. And also, I want to call your attention to another book of Dr. Finkelstein, Rabbi Akiba, which is a most interesting study of one of the great leaders of the let us say, the humanist wing of the Pharisees. Now, another question is what version of the Bible I was quoting. I was quoting actually from the King James Version. At some points here and there last time, I think I used my own translation, but mainly I translated from the Hebrew, but mainly I was using the King James Version. Now I come to some questions. What essential differences do you see between religious faith and religious forms, the difference between Christianity and Christendom, between Judaism and Jewdom? Well, that's an embarrassing question because I believe indeed that there is a great difference between religious faith and religious forms. I have sometimes the impression that as far as the majority of American Jews are concerned, that their form of religion is essentially an ancestor worship, which is expressed when they go on holidays to the synagogues to pray for the dead. Somewhat embellished by matzahs and somewhat less strenuous activities in life. But that all this has very little to do with Jewish tradition. Now, I'm not perhaps the right one to make such a statement because it's made from an entirely negative standpoint. I'm saying what I think Jewish tradition is not. But in this way, nevertheless, I'm trying to answer the question of the difference between faith, in this particular case, Jewish faith, and certain religious forms. Of course, that's not only a phenomenon which has happened in Judaism, it has happened in all other religions, which unfortunately have, in which you find a great deformation of the original religious meaning. Here's another question. A man must be ready before the Messiah will appear. That is, it must have achieved peace, harmony, understanding, etc. Then excuse the impression, but who needs him? The Messiah. In other words, if all is achieved before he comes, what is he supposed to do? Well, that's a very good question. Maybe nobody needs him. But I would say one thing to the writer of this question. If you really are very serious about achieving freedom and harmony and peace, you wouldn't even be interested whether you need him or not. Because you would be only interested in one thing. In every step you can go to achieve that which leads, as I try to show, to the Messianic time. The question who needs him and who doesn't, whether one needs him or not, is really quite irrelevant. Because that question can only be asked from the void or from lack of interest in the seriousness of the human task, which is implied here. Another question says, why should an omnipotent, omniscient God produce a world with iniquities? Why should the innocent suffer and be afflicted with dreaded diseases? Why should man be endowed with a propensity for iniquities? Well, I'm the wrong one to address this question, and so I leave it unanswered, really. Is the fear of death the basic cause for man to cling to his ego, in the sense that ego absorption gives him a feeling he is eternal? Yes, that I think is true, but on the other hand, the fear of death is not only the reason for clinging to the ego. The clinging to the ego is the reason for the fear of death. If I am not expecting that I am indestructible, or that there's anything absolute which I must attain in life, if I'm at the point where I have nothing to lose, then I have nothing to fear. Now, if I say I have nothing to lose, this may sound like a statement of despair, but it is in fact a statement, I would say, which is common to all theological and non-theological mystical thinking. that man has nothing to lose because he cannot hold on to anything. All he can do is to be, and to be is to be alive, and to be alive is to respond every moment to his fellow man, to nature, to everything in the world. That is the only thing he can achieve. Everything else ends in loss and tragedy. This is the basic teaching of Buddhism, that the suffering of man is necessary as long as man is compulsively attached to things and lives under the illusions of the eternity or of the absoluteness of his own ego. Therefore, if he doesn't cling to anything, he needs not be afraid. Here's a question. Your concept of God and religion appears harmonious to Marxism, in which man makes his own destiny. Yet why, in a practical sense, are religious people at such odds with a basically humanistic philosophy? There are many reasons for that, why people are so against Marxist philosophy. One reason is that Marxist philosophy has been so totally distorted by its Soviet form. As the great economist Schumpeter once wrote, the Soviet form of Marxism is as different from Marxist thinking as the great inquisitors were different from the teachings of Christ. This doesn't imply to compare Marx with Christ. It does just implies to show a tremendous distortion. But incidentally, I want to say to this question, there are today quite a few people who, in all religious camps, who are not at all so opposed to humanist philosophy, including its Marxist forms. You find them particularly among Jesuits. You find them also among humanists in the Protestant Church. You find them among humanists in all camps. You find, in fact, in the last, I would say, 10 years, a remarkable renaissance of humanism all over the world. I may have probably spoke of that in the first lecture. And there you find great receptiveness to all humanist concepts and a rather sympathy also for the humanism of Marx. And you find a good deal of understanding of the difference between Marx and its distortion. It's very interesting that, for instance, in Germany, for years, the best Marx studies have been done by Protestant theologians. In France, the best Marx studies have been done by Catholic theologians. Well, there have been a few in France, in Germany, also by non-religious people. But there is indeed a great affinity, precisely because of the affinity between humanism in all its forms and the Judeo-Christian tradition. There's a question here which says in your first lecture, you stated, those who do not believe in God still try to do God's will. This sounds like an absurdity. And are you referring to the concept of conscience, which does not necessarily include concept of God? Well, in the first place, I didn't say those who do not believe in God still try to do God's will. I wish that were so. Then those who would believe in God try to do God's will, and those who don't believe try to do God's will also. But most people these days don't try to do God's will at all. The world wouldn't be as it is if that were the case. I raised the question of what is the religious position from a Catholic standpoint, to a man who does not believe in God and yet tries to do God's will. And I added, not subjectively in terms of that he tries to do God's will, but objectively, in terms of what doing God's will is. This is not just a matter of intention, doing God's will. From the Catholic tradition, from the Protestant tradition, from the Jewish tradition, one can also describe what, objectively speaking, doing God's will means. You can describe it from the prophets. It means to be humble, to do justice, to say the truth, to love thy neighbor, and to loosen the chains of the prisoners, to liberate those, to help those who are imprisoned, to have compassion with all that is human, with all that is animal. All that permits us to determine objectively what, in the sense of the Jewish and Christian tradition, is meant by doing God's will. And indeed, what I was referring to is something I shall come back to in the next lecture, namely, what is the difference between the subjective thought concepts of doing God's will and what is the reality of a human attitude, which does God's will even though consciously he does not do it in those terms. So in a way, I shall try to answer this question indirectly next time. But I should like to mention here, perhaps as a preliminary answer, a Hasidic story, and I'm not sure whether I mentioned it before, of the man who was asked why he visits the Hasidic leader. And I think I mentioned it before, and he says, it's not because I want to hear his words of wisdom, but I want to see how he ties his shoelaces. That is religious reality, how somebody ties his shoelaces. Now you might think, or some of you might think, this is just using words. It isn't. There is no gesture of a man which is not an expression of his inner substance. Man has a peculiar quality. He can lie in two ways. He can lie with his words and he can lie with his face. That is to say, if he lies with his words, that's one thing. It's more difficult to see when he lies with his face, because his eyes, his facial expression seem to convey something which may not at all be that which is the reality in him. He may smile at you and look at you as if you were his best friends and might want to kill you. Man has these peculiar capacities of lying, being able to lie with his face. However, he can usually not lie with his gestures. He cannot lie with the form of his hands. He cannot lie with the form of his body. That's why, for instance, handwriting, the analysis of handwriting is usually a very good clue to the character of a person, because handwriting is just a frozen form of gestures, and it is very difficult for a man to lie with his gestures. The least reliable thing in men are his words and his facial expression, because that is indeed that with which we can lie. And therefore, the words a man says or the thoughts he has are the least important part of that which indicates the substance in him. The way in which he behaves, and precisely the way in which he ties his shoelaces. That is, using it here, of course, more symbolically than just tying the shoelaces is the most important thing a man can do. That shows us something of the man. But it's certainly more revealing to see how a man eats than how a man ties his shoelaces. If you watch a man eating for some time, you know a lot about him. And there too, his gestures can be somewhat controlled by good education, but you might still discover the real man in the way he eats, in many other things, which are more important than his thoughts. In this feeling you describe, increasing hopelessness in man, is it at all related to less harmony between man and nature? I think it is related to less harmony between man and nature. Perhaps that is just a footnote. If I could name one man who was one of the greatest humanists, and in whose vision the relationship between man and nature was one of harmony, it was Goethe. And today we see the relationship between man and nature is, if you can use that word, the conquest of nature, the conquest of space. The man as conquering nature to such an extent that he can even use the forces of nature for his own destruction, and perhaps for the destruction of everything that is alive. That is not a relationship of harmony. That's not a relationship of humanization of nature, but it is a relationship in which nature is the object, and man dominates and conquers it. And what he does with it is indeed at the moment seems very dangerous. What is your opinion of Toynbee's interpretation of Marxism as a variation of Judaism's apocalyptic message? Do you detect any anti-Semitic bias in this analysis? Well, I'm afraid the Jews are awfully sensitive to anti-Semitic bias. And so many men have been accused of anti-Semitic bias because they have made some statement about Jews which does not give the fullest praise the Jews expect to be given. The Jews have not always praised other nations that carefully. In fact, they have shown a remarkable degree of clannishness throughout the centuries. I do not detect any anti-Semitic bias in that. I have never detected any anti-Semitic bias in Toynbee's writing, and I think besides he's right that Marxism is a variation of the Judaism's apocalyptic message. Whether that is said as a compliment or whether that is said as a criticism, that is a matter of opinion. Is not the ideal polarity you speak of as hope and peaceful waiting what the Christian theologians might call faith? If not, what are the distinctions between the idea, polarity, and faith? Well, I think that is quite true. In faith, you have indeed the synthesis of the two poles in any true faith. And therefore, faith is patient, and yet faith is at the same time not fanatical, if it is real faith. In Hebrew, you have another word for faith, which is emuno, which really has the root meaning of certainty. And that is not so different. You are certain without having proof, because you are certain because you have conviction. And therefore, there are certain things for which you do not need proof. But in this kind of certainty also, it is not a passive act of waiting. It's a conviction which has been formed on the basis of your own development, your own experience, and your own understanding. Here's a question. What really is a Messianic hope right now? Is there any chance of its fulfillment? On what does its fulfillment depend? Well, indeed, you might say there's a Messianic hope right now if you follow certain of our apocalyptic predictions that the worst disaster must come over mankind in order to permit the arrival of Messiah. By which I mean to say that if you consider the possibility of nuclear war as a disaster which in the apocalyptic literature is described, then indeed we might have a Messianic hope. But I cannot believe that. I believe there are limitations to disaster even, and that this disaster would lead in the very best case, to complete barbarism. What really is a Messianic hope now? Well, there is very little. People expect destruction. People play around with destruction and make their own rationalizations for it. This is just what I have been saying, that the 19th century was a century of hope. And our century, I think, Auden has said, used this word, is a century of anxiety, is a century of despair, is a century of hopelessness. On what does its fulfillment depend? I would simply say that man comes to his reasons and wakes up to reality, rather than to be gazing in a mad way to gadgets he builds, which have nothing to do whatsoever with human reality. I was the other day talking with some physicists, some younger physicists, and they were talking about the question of values and how the world could be. And one physicist formulated the question the following way. Now, for example, we discovered a new planet, or not a planet, a star, which we could populate by space travel. How should be the laws and regulations for this new colony of the Earth? Well, you can see how far one has to go to think of a better world in an alienated form than by having to think of a new planet or star which one has to populate. When our problem is right here and now, what could we do to make this, to transform this world from the madhouse it is at the moment to a world which makes sense? Now, there's a last question, which says you imply that in order to transcend oneself and to be open to others, one must rid himself of his ego. It would seem rather that one must develop and maintain his ego strength, understand himself before he can be or while he is receptive to others. Well, this is familiar language to me. This is the language of my profession, namely the language of ego strength. The way in which I have used the word ego here in this lecture is different from the way it is technically used in psychoanalysis and in psychiatry. I have used the word ego here in the sense of the traditional religious literature, mystical literature, although they do not use the word ego there. That word, I must admit, is a modern usage, this term. But it's one thing what's called ego strength. That is to say, the strength of the organization within a man, of the structure which keeps him together instead of falling to pieces. And in fact, it is much more astonishing to me that most people don't fall to pieces rather than the other way around, that one asks why some do. Certainly, from the information they get about life and from the principle they learn in practice, it's remarkable that they don't fall to pieces. At least most of them don't. But this is something else from what I meant here by ego, namely this unrelated substance I, my body, my things, my memory, my name, this thing which I have, namely, again, my body, my life, all that, which stands in the way of being open to the world in the most extreme form, as I have said before, in the person who is extremely narcissistic, for whom reality is only he, and he. And this is something quite different from ego strength. You have to break down the illusion about this absolute individual thing, I, in order to be fully open to the world. If I could use an example which is sometimes used in the mystical literature, if you watch, let us say, a fountain, and then on top of each spray of water forms a little drop. And for a moment this is a distinct little drop. And then the little drop falls back into the water and becomes one with the water again. Now if this little drop could think and feel, he might think, am I not wonderful? Am I not indestructible? Am I not all something separate from all other drops? And yet we would kind of pity him for his illusion, because we have seen that he has been part of the water, and in a split of a second he will be part of the water again, and only for this very moment he is that specific separate little drop of water. Well, from this standpoint, one would say this illusion that man is such a separate entity, separate from the rest of all, and remaining separate, that indeed is an illusion. But man can be, and that is a real paradox, I would say, of this type of experience. Man can experience himself as separate, and for that he needs ego strength, speaking psychiatric language, and at the same time feel that he is one with everything, with everybody and everything. In fact, this oneness he can experience only fully if he has gone through the separateness. And this is precisely the thought of history of development of man, which I have been trying to talk about. Namely, man goes through separation in order to arrive at new unity. If he has never experienced separation, he cannot feel unity. Or you might say, using other words, Love is only possible when man has felt deeply his separateness from others. Then he can love, because in the act of love is an overcoming of the separateness. If man has never felt the separateness like a little baby, he can cling to, he can hold on to, he can do anything, attach himself to the person from whom he is not separate, but he cannot love, because love is overcoming a gap. Love is a miracle of transforming the separateness of all of us into unity, and therefore you have the paradox that separateness and love belong together, in the same way as the capacity to be oneself, which requires ego strength, and the capacity to get rid of one's ego in the sense of this separate personality. These two poles belong together, and they are, as far as I can see, the essence of a spiritual experience, which I shall talk about somewhat more next time. Thank you.